I was 13 when I realized my father could no longer look me in the eye. The birthmark that spread across half my face like spilled wine had always been there, but after my mother died, it became something else to him. It became the reason doors closed before we could knock, the reason conversations ended when we entered the general store, the reason his hands trembled when he counted coins that would never be enough to change what I was. By my 20th winter, he had paraded me before 7 families in 3 counties, each visit ending the same way. The mothers would glance once and busy themselves with suddenly urgent kitchen tasks. The sons would study their boots as if the leather held prophecies. My father would apologize for wasting their time, his voice growing smaller with each rejection, until I wondered if he might disappear entirely into his shame. Then came the morning I woke to find him dressed in clothes I had never seen, old garments that smelled of cedar and something darker. He would not say where he had been the night before, but his eyes carried a haunted quality, and his pockets jingled with gold coins that caught the light in ways that made my stomach turn. He told me to pack only what I could carry in one cloth bundle. We left before dawn, climbing into mountains where the trees grew so thick the sunlight forgot how to reach the ground. He walked ahead without speaking, following a path that existed only in his desperate memory, leading me towards something he had promised, to a darkness I did not yet understand. The stone circle appeared through the mist like a mouth opening in the earth, each ancient marker leaning inward, as though listening to secrets the mountain had kept for centuries. My father stopped at its edge, his breathing ragged, his hand trembling as it slipped from mine for the last time. He would not step inside that sacred boundary, would not meet whatever waited in the shadows beyond those weathered stones. I understood then that he had brought me to the threshold of a world he feared more than his own shame. The vigor emerged, not with footsteps, but with presence. A shifting of darkness that became solid and vast, towering over the tallest stone marker like an ancient tree given terrible form. Antlers crowned a head that seemed carved from mountain rock and moonlight, and eyes that held the gold of autumn leaves watched me with an intelligence that made my breath catch. He did not move closer, did not reach for me, simply stood in patient stillness as if he had waited here since the world was young. The morning birds had gone silent, and I realized nature itself was holding its breath. My father spoke words in a language I had never heard him use, his voice breaking on syllables that tasted of blood oaths and desperate bargains. The creature's gaze never left my face, studying the mark that had defined my unworthiness with what I could only name as recognition, perhaps even reverence. Something passed between them, sealed in that heavy silence, something that made my father turn away, weeping, when the creature finally extended one massive hand toward me, palm upturned in invitation rather than demand. I understood that my father had not sold me to a monster but to something far older than such simple words could contain. I looked back once and saw my father collapsed at the circle's edge, gold coins spilling from his pockets into the moss like payment for a daughter he could not bear to keep. The creature waited with inhuman patience, his hand still offered, his ancient eyes holding something that looked almost like compassion. I stepped forward, crossing the boundary between the world that had rejected me and whatever lay beyond, and the mist closed behind me like a door that would never open the same way. Again, his fingers closed gently around mine, rough as bark and warm as summer stone, and he led me deeper into the wilderness where morning had not yet learned to reach. The cave he brought me to was not the dark prison I had imagined, but a cathedral carved by centuries of water and wind, its walls smooth as silk and gleaming with mineral veins that caught the dim light like fallen stars. He left me by a fire already burning, its source a mystery, and disappeared into passages that twisted deeper into the mountain's heart. I sat alone, with only the crackling flames and the distant drip of water, understanding that I had been given space to breathe, to adjust, to survive this first abandonment by everything I had known. He returned at dusk, carrying an armful of provisions that spoke of careful preparation rather than sudden impulse. Furs, softer than any I had touched, were laid beside the fire, arranged with a precision that seemed almost ceremonial. Berries and roots appeared in a wooden bowl, worn smooth by countless years, and he placed them within my reach before retreating to the shadows where his eyes remained visible, watchful, but never threatening. I ate in silence while he observed, and I wondered how many others had sat in this exact place, sustained by hands that had learned gentleness despite their terrible form. On the third morning, I woke to find wildflowers arranged on the stone beside my head, their petals still wet with mountain dew. He sat across the cavern, motionless as the rock itself, but when I lifted the flowers to breathe their fragrance, something shifted in his expression that might have been relief or perhaps recognition. I understood then that these were not gifts, but a language he was desperately trying to speak. The days blurred into a rhythm of silent coexistence where meaning lived in gestures, and the space between us slowly transformed from distance into something closer to understanding. When the first storm came howling through the mountain passes, I learned the difference between captivity and protection. He appeared from the deeper chambers carrying armloads of dried moss and positioned himself between me and the cave mouth, his massive frame blocking the wind that shrieked like something alive and furious. Throughout that endless night, he never moved from his post, and when dawn finally broke, I found ice crystals in his hair that he had allowed to form rather than abandon his vigil. I began to notice the small kindnesses woven into our wordless existence, gestures so subtle they might have been accidents if not for their constant repetition. He always placed my water where morning light would warm it first. The furs he brought were arranged in layers, the softest against my skin, as though he understood the tenderness required by flesh more fragile than his own. When I wept one afternoon for reasons I could not name, he approached with hesitant steps and laid a single feather beside my hand before retreating, offering comfort in the only vocabulary he possessed. One evening, I caught him watching me sketch the cave walls in the dirt with a stick, and his eyes held an expression I finally recognized. Not hunger or possession, but longing so profound it seemed older than the stones surrounding us. He was not keeping me prisoner, but rather keeping vigil over something precious he feared the world would break again. The paintings began where firelight barely reached, hidden in alcoves I had dismissed as mere shadows. I found the first by accident, when a dropped bowl rolled into darkness, and I crawled after it with trembling hands. There, preserved by centuries of mountain cold, were images rendered in ochre and charcoal that stopped my breath completely. Women's faces lined the stone like a gallery of the forsaken, each bearing marks the world called monstrous. Some wore scars that twisted their features into permanent masks of survival. Others showed limbs that bent wrongly, or skin mottled with stains like my own birthmark, that wine-dark continent covering half my face that had made grown men turn away at my father's table. Beneath each portrait, the same figure appeared, this towering sentinel offering not chains, but open palms, leading them toward crude drawings of shelter and fire. I traced one image obsessively, a woman whose face bore burns so severe the artist had drawn tears falling from her remaining eye. Below her, painted with obvious care, she stood crowned in flowers, while the creature knelt at her feet. The composition spoke of reverence, not dominion, as though these mountains had always been a kingdom where the broken were finally recognized as holy. When he found me there hours later, I did not flinch away. Instead, I pointed to the walls, then to my birthmark, then to him, asking the question that changed. Everything. He nodded slowly, and in his ancient eyes I saw the weight of being sanctuary for the world's refused daughters. The moon rose full and merciless that night, flooding the cave mouth with silver light that made everything feel suspended between worlds. I could not sleep, haunted by those painted women who had found refuge in these forsaken heights, while I still felt like a bargaining chip in my father's shame. He sat at the entrance as always, that impossible silhouette against the stars, and I realized he kept vigil not as my jailer, but as my guardian against a world more monstrous than his form. I rose without deciding to, drawn by something deeper than thought, and moved to where he sat wrapped in perpetual solitude. His breathing changed when I approached, becoming careful and still, as though any movement might shatter this fragile moment we had built through months of wordless coexistence. My hand lifted of its own accord, trembling in the space between us, hovering near the rough texture of his face that had never known gentle touch. When my fingers finally made contact, tracing the ridge of his brow and the sharp angle of his jaw, he released a sound I can only describe as centuries exhaling. His eyes closed with such profound surrender that I understood immediately. This creature who had sheltered countless rejected daughters had himself been starving for tenderness. Whatever curse bound him to these mountains, it had not stripped away his ability to feel, only to be seen as worthy of feeling. We stayed frozen in that gesture until dawn began breaking, two outcasts finally recognizing in each other what the world had refused to acknowledge, that even the marked and monstrous deserved to be touched with reverence. The sound of boots on stone shattered our sanctuary 3 months after the night I first touched his face. My father emerged from the morning fog with 2 pack horses laden with chests, his eyes wild with something between remorse and greed. He called my name like I was still his property, still the daughter whose marked face had driven him to desperate bargains. But I stepped forward from the cave as someone utterly transformed, wearing furs and wildflowers, no longer hiding behind my hair. He fell to his knees, spilling words about guilt and gold, about how the town had prospered since his deal, and now he could afford physicians who might heal me. The way he said heal made my blood turn cold, as though my birthmark was still a wound that needed curing. Behind me I felt my guardian tense, centuries of witnessing this same scene playing out in his ancient bones. My father extended his hand, offering me redemption in the eyes of people who had only ever seen me as damaged. I looked at that outstretched hand, then back at the cave where I had learned that being seen and being valued are not the same thing. My father's gold could buy surgeons, but not the kind of sight that sees past surfaces to the soul beneath. The creature behind me had never once asked me to change, never flinched from my face, never treated my difference as something requiring forgiveness. The choice stood before me like a chasm: return to a world that would accept me only if I was altered, or remain with the one who had accepted me exactly as I was. My father's voice cracked with desperation, promising everything except the one thing that mattered, that he had ever truly seen me at all. After my father's shadow finally retreated down the mountain, I turned to find my guardian kneeling in the dirt, drawing with deliberate strokes. His massive hands moved with unexpected grace, sketching figures that made my breath catch in recognition. The first image showed a man, unmarked and ordinary, standing before a woman whose body was twisted in ways the world called broken. Around them, he drew faces contorted with rage and judgment, hands pointing in condemnation. His claw traced the next scene with trembling precision, showing the same man transformed into something monstrous, bound by symbols that pulsed with ancient meaning even in simple dirt drawings. Then came images of women throughout the ages, each bearing marks or differences the world rejected, each brought to these mountains. He looked up at me with eyes that held centuries of the same story repeating, the same curse born from the simple sin of loving someone deemed unworthy. He pressed his palm flat against his chest, then pointed to the drawings, then to me, and the weight of understanding nearly crushed me. He had been human once, punished for the same defiance I now faced, transformed into legend for refusing to accept that some people deserved less love. His curse was not cruelty, but an eternal witness, doomed to offer sanctuary to those the world discarded while remaining forever separate. I knelt beside him in the dirt, and placed my marked face against his transformed one, feeling his shudder of recognition. We were both monuments to the world's fear of difference, both exiled for the crime of seeing beauty where others saw only flaws. The cave paintings showed me what words could not, a ritual performed by those who came before, women who chose to stay rather than return to a world that saw them as less. I gathered the elements shown in the ancient images: water from the deepest spring, ash from the eternal fire that burned in the mountain's heart, petals from the night-bloom flowers that only opened under moonlight. My hands shook not from fear, but from the magnitude of what I was about to declare, a binding not born from my father's desperation, but from my own awakening will. Under the full moon, I drew the symbols on my skin and his, marking us both with the language of forgotten things. He watched with eyes that held both hope and terror, understanding that I was choosing him not as punishment or obligation, but as liberation from everything that had defined us through pain. When I spoke the words I'd memorized from the cave walls, the mountain itself seemed to hold its breath, and I felt something ancient shift in recognition, accepting what the world below never could. The moment my marked hand joined with his transformed one, warmth flooded through us, both like sunrise breaking through eternal night. His form didn't change, but something in his eyes became lighter, younger, as if centuries of sorrow began slowly unwinding. I felt my own spirit expand beyond the prison of my father's shame, beyond every mirror that showed me only what I lacked, into something vast and wild and finally mine. We stood together as the ritual settled into our bones, no longer exile and outcast, but sovereign and chosen, rulers of our own truth. They found my journal 3 winters after I stopped counting seasons, leather-bound pages filled with a story no one in the valley could accept as truth. The hunters who discovered it at the edge of the stone circle spoke of it in whispers, half believing, half afraid to believe that someone like me had chosen this wild sovereignty. My father's name faded from memory, but mine grew into legend, the scarred daughter who walked into the mountains and became something the world had no word for. They say my story is a warning, but I know it as the first breath I ever truly took. Some nights, travelers swear they see us on the highest ridges, 2 figures moving through the mist, like poetry written in shadow and moonlight. They cannot tell where I end, and he begins, cannot distinguish between woman and wilderness, between curse and consecration. We are the answer to a question the world was too afraid to ask, proof that belonging is not granted by those who reject you, but claimed by those brave enough to redefine themselves. The children who hear our story understand what their parents cannot, that monsters are made by those who refuse to see. I left behind the mirror that showed me only absence, and found instead a reflection in his ancient eyes that showed me everything. The birthmark that made me unmarriageable became the map that led me home to myself. My father's gold turned to dust, but the wealth I found in these mountains, in this love that needed no human blessing, outlives stone itself. I am no longer the daughter too marked to be loved, but the woman who marked the world with her choosing. They call me lost, but I have never been more found, walking these eternal hills with the one who saw my worth when I was still learning its language. Would you have chosen the mountain or returned to the valley? Subscribe to walk between worlds with me.